When Helen Rodriguez became Austin's most trusted university librarian, students and faculty gave her access to their research and personal documents. But when her opioid addiction and academic fraud schemes consumed her, she began selling thesis papers and murdering whistleblowers who discovered her crimes, turning the library into a deadly information black market. Before starting the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the video. The Texas afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Austin's prestigious university library as Helen Rodriguez organized rare manuscripts and digital archives for what would become the most dangerous academic consultation of her 20-year career as the Southwest's most experienced university librarian and research specialist. At 46 years old, Helen had established herself as Austin's premier academic information expert, specializing in graduate research assistance and doctoral dissertation support that attracted ambitious PhD candidates, visiting scholars and faculty members who valued her expertise in locating obscure sources and her reputation for providing absolutely confidential research guidance for the most sensitive academic projects. Helen's library domain encompassed the university's most secure research archives, featuring restricted manuscript collections, digital database access systems, and private study rooms where scholars could examine classified materials and conduct confidential research without concern for academic espionage or intellectual property theft. Her clients included doctoral students whose groundbreaking research required access to proprietary databases, international scholars conducting sensitive political research, and faculty members whose grant applications demanded verification of exclusive source materials. The interior of Helen's research archive reflected her mastery of academic information systems and her understanding of scholarly researchers' expectations for both resource access and absolute confidentiality during their most critical academic work, featuring walls lined with rare book collections, testimonials from grateful PhD recipients whose dissertations had been completed through her research assistants, and sophisticated computer terminals providing access to restricted academic databases and classified research materials. But beneath Helen's reputation for academic excellence lay a dangerous combination of prescription opioid addiction, systematic academic fraud, and calculated murder that had transformed her library services into criminal enterprises, where threatening researchers and suspicious investigators met their fate through stolen intellectual property and witness elimination during vulnerable research consultations. "Good afternoon, Helen," said Dr. Patricia Kim, her 2 o'clock appointment and a 41-year-old visiting psychology professor, whose groundbreaking autism research required access to restricted clinical studies and confidential patient databases that Helen had been helping her locate for her upcoming publication. Patricia had recently discovered that portions of her research had appeared in other scholars' work and had begun questioning Helen's explanations about database sharing protocols and academic research collaboration procedures. "Good afternoon, Dr. Kim," Helen replied with the academic authority and research expertise that had made her legendary among Austin's university community, who viewed her as both information specialist and intellectual guardian, capable of unlocking the most challenging research problems while maintaining absolute discretion about scholars' competitive academic projects and sensitive research methodologies. "I've located the additional clinical databases you requested for your autism study, and I believe these resources will provide exactly the statistical validation your research requires for publication in the top-tier journals." Patricia had become Helen's most dangerous client, not because of her demanding research requirements or her project's complexity, but because of her recent discovery of plagiarized materials and her growing awareness of the academic fraud operation that Helen had been conducting while supposedly providing legitimate research assistance to the university's scholarly community. What Patricia didn't know was that Helen had been systematically stealing intellectual property and murdering suspicious academics for over 4 years, using her library expertise and access to confidential research to sell original ideas to competing scholars while eliminating anyone who discovered her theft of dissertations, grant proposals, and breakthrough research findings. Helen's transformation from dedicated librarian to calculating killer had begun 6 years earlier when her prescription opioid addiction had escalated from legitimate pain management following a workplace injury to daily dependency on various prescription drugs that consumed her university salary and forced her into desperate relationships with organized crime figures who controlled Texas's prescription drug distribution networks and academic fraud operations. Her addiction had grown to cost over $500 per day, while her access to the university's most valuable intellectual property had provided perfect opportunities for conducting sophisticated academic theft that generated substantial income through sales to competing researchers and international academic fraud networks. Faced with increasing pressure from drug suppliers and potential exposure by suspicious faculty members, Helen had begun using her library expertise to conduct systematic academic fraud operations, stealing original research from PhD candidates and faculty members while coordinating with criminal organizations who purchased intellectual property and eliminated potential witnesses to academic theft and research espionage activities. Her criminal activities had escalated when several researchers had discovered evidence of intellectual property theft and had threatened to report their suspicions to university authorities and law enforcement agencies, investigating academic fraud patterns targeting research universities and graduate programs. Helen had murdered her first victim, a promising PhD candidate who had detected unauthorized access to her dissertation research, by injecting her with a lethal dose of concentrated fentanyl during what appeared to be a routine research consultation in the library's private study area. The success of her first murder had convinced Helen that eliminating suspicious researchers and threatening investigators was both necessary for protecting her academic fraud operation and relatively easy to accomplish given her intimate knowledge of researchers' schedules and her access to private areas of the library where deaths could be staged as drug overdoses related to academic stress and graduate student mental health crises. Over the following 4 years, Helen had murdered 12 additional individuals using various methods that took advantage of her library knowledge, her understanding of academic researchers' isolation and vulnerability, and her ability to stage deaths as suicide or accidental overdoses that occurred during high-stress periods of dissertation writing, grant application deadlines, and tenure review processes. Her victims had been carefully selected based on their discovery of her criminal activities, their possession of particularly valuable research, and their isolated working patterns that made their deaths easier to attribute to academic pressure and mental health issues. Her victims had included Dr. Robert Chen, a computer science professor who had discovered evidence of research theft and whose late-night library session had resulted in fatal poisoning from contaminated coffee delivered during what appeared to be friendly colleague support. Jennifer Martinez, a graduate student who had reported suspicious access to her research databases and whose private study session had ended in fatal overdose from prescription drugs planted in her research materials. And David Foster, a federal academic fraud investigator who had been tracking intellectual property theft and whose library consultation had resulted in fatal exposure to concentrated carfentanil disguised as library preservation chemical accident. Helen, I need to discuss some serious concerns about academic fraud and reports of intellectual property theft connected to your library services, said Detective Sarah Rodriguez of the Austin Police Department's White-Collar Crime Division, as she arrived at the library carrying warrants to inspect Helen's computer systems and interview her about suspicious activities. Detective Rodriguez specialized in investigating academic fraud and had developed expertise in recognizing patterns of intellectual property theft that exploited library services and researchers' trust in academic information professionals. Detective Rodriguez's investigation represented an existential threat to Helen's criminal operation, as her law enforcement expertise and access to academic fraud databases could expose the systematic theft operations and connect her to multiple suspicious deaths during research consultations and library services. Of course, Detective Rodriguez, Helen replied, though she felt the familiar surge of opioid withdrawal anxiety and criminal desperation that accompanied any official scrutiny of her library operations by law enforcement officers who possessed the training and resources to detect evidence of academic fraud and systematic murder disguised as researcher suicides or academic stress-related deaths. Academic integrity and research confidentiality are always my highest priorities, and I want to cooperate with any investigation that might help protect scholars and ensure that library services operate according to all applicable university policies and legal requirements. Detective Rodriguez consulted detailed reports from academic fraud investigators and suspicious death analysts that showed patterns of intellectual property theft and researcher deaths that suggested systematic criminal activity rather than random academic misconduct or legitimate researcher mental health crises during graduate study pressures. Helen, I've been investigating reports of academic fraud and intellectual property theft that appear to be connected to researchers who have used your library services and research assistance, Detective Rodriguez said, with the investigative precision that had made her successful in solving complex academic crime cases. 12 individuals who were clients of your library research services have died under suspicious circumstances, with several of these deaths occurring after the victims had discovered unauthorized access to their research materials or had reported concerns about plagiarism and theft of their intellectual property. The detective's identification of the theft patterns and her recognition of the timing correlation between fraud discoveries and researcher deaths confirmed Helen's worst fears that her criminal activities had been analyzed and connected to her systematic elimination of suspicious academics and exploitation of library access for organized intellectual property theft and academic fraud operations. Helen's response was swift and deadly, as she realized that eliminating Detective Rodriguez was essential for protecting her criminal enterprise and preventing exposure of her systematic academic fraud and murder operations. Detective Rodriguez, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the intense pressure that academic researchers face and the unfortunate reality that graduate students and faculty often experience mental health crises despite proper institutional support systems, Helen said, while discreetly reaching for a modified book scanner that she had weaponized to release aerosolized fentanyl through ventilation systems activated by scanning specific book codes for emergency elimination of law enforcement threats. Perhaps we could discuss these concerns in our rare manuscript vault, where I can demonstrate the security procedures that might explain these tragic coincidences. Academic research involves highly competitive environments that might appear suspicious to those unfamiliar with university intellectual property protocols and research collaboration procedures. Detective Rodriguez agreed to examine Helen's library security procedures, not realizing that the librarian was leading her to a sealed manuscript vault where previous murders had been committed and where Helen planned to kill her using her weaponized scanner that would fill the enclosed space with fatal fentanyl while appearing to be accidental exposure to document preservation chemicals. Helen's plan involved convincing Detective Rodriguez to examine specific manuscript security while explaining library procedures, then activating her modified scanner to release concentrated fentanyl that would cause rapid respiratory failure while appearing to be accidental chemical exposure from rare document preservation systems rather than deliberate murder by a librarian protecting her academic fraud and drug trafficking operations. But Helen's carefully planned murder of the detective was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of federal agents who had been investigating prescription drug trafficking networks and had identified connections to her university library position. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the DEA's Prescription Drug Diversion Division had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into opioid trafficking and addiction-related academic crimes that exploited university positions to facilitate prescription drug distribution and eliminate potential witnesses to criminal activities. Agent Walsh specialized in investigating drug-related academic fraud and had developed expertise in tracking criminal librarians and academic professionals who were used to launder drug proceeds while conducting systematic elimination of threats to prescription drug trafficking networks. The federal investigation had been initiated by reports from multiple university health services and prescription monitoring programs who had noticed patterns of suspicious prescription activity and academic-related deaths that suggested organized criminal networks were using university positions to facilitate prescription drug fraud while eliminating potential witnesses through sophisticated poisoning methods disguised as academic stress casualties. Agent Walsh had been conducting surveillance of Helen's prescription drug procurement activities and library operations, and had documented evidence of systematic opioid abuse, involvement in academic fraud, and suspicious patterns of researcher deaths that suggested her library expertise was being used for organized criminal activity rather than legitimate academic services. "Helen Rodriguez, I'm Special Agent Walsh with the DEA," she announced as she entered the manuscript vault where Helen was preparing to poison Detective Rodriguez. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of prescription drug trafficking, systematic academic fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic exploitation of library services for criminal intellectual property, theft, and drug-related elimination operations." Helen's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of academic authority confusion and desperate attempts to maintain her library credibility, as she realized that law enforcement agencies at multiple levels had been investigating her drug activities and had connected them to systematic researcher murders and organized academic fraud. Her carefully maintained reputation as a dedicated librarian had failed to protect her from comprehensive investigation by agencies with expertise in prescription drug crimes and academic fraud. "Special Agent Walsh, there must be some serious misunderstanding about legitimate library research assistance and the complex academic support services involved in graduate education that require access to confidential databases and restricted research materials," Helen said frantically, while abandoning her plan to poison Detective Rodriguez and attempting to preserve some semblance of academic professionalism, despite the overwhelming evidence against her criminal activities. "I am a professional librarian with 20 years of experience providing research support for Austin's most distinguished scholars and graduate students. All of my library work complies with established academic standards and university policies designed to ensure research integrity and student success." Detective Rodriguez looked absolutely shocked as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the librarian she had been investigating for academic fraud. Her white-collar crime investigation had not only exposed Helen's theft and murder operation, but had also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who had been using library services as cover for systematic elimination of researchers and law enforcement threats. The comprehensive investigation that followed Helen's arrest revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods she had developed to exploit library expertise for systematic academic fraud and murder. Forensic analysis of Helen's library operations revealed extensive evidence of her academic crimes, including sophisticated systems for copying and selling research materials, networks for distributing stolen intellectual property to international buyers, and detailed records showing coordination between theft operations and researcher elimination schedules. Her library spaces contained weaponized academic equipment, prescription drug trafficking documentation, and comprehensive files containing stolen research worth millions of dollars that had been systematically pilfered from university scholars. The investigation also uncovered Helen's connections to organized crime figures who had been coordinating prescription drug trafficking and academic fraud operations while using her library position to steal valuable research and eliminate potential witnesses through sophisticated drug poisoning methods disguised as academic stress casualties. Most disturbing was the discovery of Helen's detailed knowledge of prescription drug effects in academic research schedules, which she had used to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for stealing intellectual property while eliminating threats through library equipment that had been modified to deliver fatal doses of synthetic opioids during private research consultations. Helen Rodriguez was ultimately convicted of 13 counts of first-degree murder, systematic academic fraud, prescription drug trafficking, conspiracy to commit organized criminal enterprise activities, and numerous other charges related to her exploitation of library services for criminal intellectual property theft and drug-related elimination operations. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout Austin's academic community, prompting immediate reforms in library access protocols, intellectual property protection measures, and prescription drug addiction prevention programs designed to protect researchers from exploitation by trusted academic professionals involved in organized criminal activities. Several other librarians and academic support staff were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of library operations and new requirements for research security, intellectual property tracking, and academic integrity, measures that made it more difficult for criminals to exploit library services for systematic theft and murder. Detective Rodriguez and Special Agent Walsh received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in academic crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying intellectual property theft operations and protecting researchers from exploitation by criminal academic professionals. Dr. Patricia Kim and other surviving researchers required extensive intellectual property recovery services and research security consultations to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted librarian had been systematically stealing their work and murdering academics while exploiting her library access for organized criminal activities. The university library system implemented comprehensive new safety protocols designed to protect researchers from exploitation by unethical library professionals. The case prompted comprehensive changes in academic library regulation, including mandatory background checks and drug testing for all library staff with research access, enhanced oversight of intellectual property handling and database security, real-time monitoring of research material access, and new reporting procedures for suspicious library activities involving researcher safety or potential academic fraud indicators. Helen's conviction also led to increased cooperation between academic institutions and law enforcement agencies investigating organized crime, with new protocols designed to identify library services that might be exploiting their research access for systematic criminal activities while eliminating potential witnesses. The academic library and broader university communities implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced screening procedures for library professionals, comprehensive researcher protection programs, mandatory reporting of suspicious academic activities, and improved training for recognizing signs of prescription drug addiction and organized crime involvement among academic staff. 5 years after Helen's conviction and life imprisonment, Austin's academic community continued to implement safeguards designed to protect researchers from library professionals who might abuse their positions of trust and research access for criminal purposes. The librarian who had promised to support academic research and preserve scholarly knowledge had instead used her library expertise and research access to commit systematic intellectual property theft and murder while exploiting scholars' trust and vulnerability during their most important academic work. However, her crimes had been thoroughly exposed, and her victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept researcher deaths as mere academic pressure casualties. Helen Rodriguez's final chapter had been permanently closed by the comprehensive investigation of justice, where she would serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, proving that even academic professionals who attempted to exploit their scholarly expertise for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent researchers from predatory library professionals. The librarian's final chapter had concluded with her permanent removal from the halls of academia, serving as a lasting reminder that those entrusted with preserving knowledge must never abuse that sacred responsibility, and that library professionals who would exploit researcher trust and academic access for criminal gain will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of scholarly integrity and intellectual freedom. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.